All right, our topic for today is Johnson's Great Society. And our objectives for this class: explain how President Johnson's war on poverty affected American communities, identify the problems that the Great Society programs addressed, detail how the Warren Court expanded individual liberties, and describe why support for the Great Society programs declined during the late 1960s. Okay, first a little background on President Lyndon B. Johnson. He was born in 1908 to an impoverished family in Texas. He was elected to the Senate in 1948 from Texas as a member of the Democratic Party. And he was selected as Senate Majority Leader just 6 years later in 1954, which gave him a lot of power over legislation. He was said to be the master of compromise in the Senate, as he was always able to find the middle ground on most issues. With that, he was chosen then by John F. Kennedy as the vice presidential candidate in 1960. And he took office in 63 as president following the assassination, and re-elected to office as president in 1964 for a full term. He was known in office for his work ethic and what was called the Johnson treatment, which, as you can see in the picture, included Johnson getting right up into constituents' faces and pretty much intimidating them into agreeing with what he was saying. So he was a very, very effective negotiator. As president, Johnson declared what he called a war on poverty. The first thing he did was the creation of the Office of Economic Opportunity, which implemented the Job Corps, Head Start, Volunteers in Service to America, and also improvements to Native American reservations. The Job Corps basically just provided money for job training for people ages 16 to 21, and provided money for public service jobs to enhance employment. Head Start was basically a preschool program for kids in order geared towards starting education earlier in life. And the Volunteers in Service to America was basically a domestic Peace Corps, essentially, that did public works projects in pretty much inner cities for the most part, and some rural areas as well. And then the improvements to Native American reservations included helping them with building new structures within the reservation, and also just allowing them a larger voice in government. And Johnson's other big initiative that kind of goes along with the war on poverty is his idea of a great society. And he did this through a number of legislative actions. The first being Medicare, which provided adequate health care for people over the age of 65. So people who were retired and couldn't get it through their employer and most likely couldn't afford to buy private health insurance. He also enacted Medicaid, which provided health insurance for the poor, so those whose employers most likely didn't carry insurance and also couldn't afford it. And then there was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, in which the Johnson administration provided a lot of monetary funds to urban schools for updating and increased instruction for teachers to basically enhance the education that was occurring in the urban schools. Then there was the Omnibus Housing Act, which basically served to build housing projects in inner cities that were designed to allow people to live in better living conditions. He also established the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which you know today as PBS, which served to broadcast educational shows. And then he also did a lot for environmental protection, such as the Water Quality Act and the Air Quality Act, which put greater restrictions on greater environmental restrictions on businesses. And this final quote was from Johnson. The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice. The Great Society is a place where every child can find knowledge to enrich his mind and to enlarge his talents. It is a place where the city of man serves not only the needs of the body and the demands of commerce, but the desire for beauty and the hunger for community.
Like Johnson's administration, the Supreme Court of the 1960s reflected the same activism we saw in Johnson's administration. Particularly, this activism was seen in Supreme Court Chief Justice Errol Warren. This activism started as early as 1954 with the Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education, which desegregated all of public areas, including school. Another Supreme Court cases that we saw and during this time was Gideon Wainwright, which declared that the states must provide lawyers at public expenses for poor defendants charged with serious crimes. Another Supreme Court case was Escobedo v. Illinois. This case, the Supreme Court case granted the accused the right to have lawyer present during police investigation. Another Supreme Court case we saw at this time during this time was Miranda v. Arizona. The Supreme Court said that the accused person must be informed of their rights at the time of their arrest. And with all this action by the Supreme Court, people saw this as kind of the court was overstepping its boundaries and it was doing too much, and as well as the federal government. The decline of the Great Society also shifted during this time. I mean, after seeing the aggressive behavior of the administration as well as the Supreme Court, we can also see that the decline of the Great Society starting over during this time. One of the reason that why the Great Society declined was attention was shifted toward foreign affairs, and Johnson administration, like any other American administration, were very involved in foreign affairs. One of the particularly affairs of the Dominican Republic. Johnson was convinced that the rebels were under communist influence, thus he deserve, or they insist that they might need his attention. He then sent some 22,000 Marines to the Dominican Republic with U.S. support, and the situation was stabilized after that. Also, in 1965, we saw Vietnam War shifting attention from domestic toward foreign affairs as well. We saw this war by 1965. The war was already escalating, and Johnson administration was putting too much attention on the war. The spending of military also increased. Thus, we didn't see as much spending being done on domestic policies such as education as well as other welfare program in the country. Also, we saw domestic opposition starting to erupt during this time. Growing domestic opposition started to erupt, which contributed to the decline of the Great Society. Congress were concerned that the Great Society was bringing too much legislation and nothing was being done, and I guess maybe Johnson administration was too aggressive and too much government was being involved. Thus, that kind of brought some sort of negative views toward the Great Society. Many local and state politicians also disliked the war on poverty because they thought that then they had like no control over the selection and the funding of these programs, and basically they saw that the federal government was also again doing too much and was basically taking their influences away. But nonetheless, even this program, although it declined at the end of his administration, but we know that for sure that this program weakened at the end of his administration, but Johnson's influence on American life endured long after his presidency ended. The Great Society program continued to bring benefits to Americans in the decades that followed his administration.
And now we'll conclude by looking at what Johnson said about the Great Society in his own words.
The Great Society asked not how much, but how good. Not only how to create wealth, but how to use it. Not only how fast we're going, but where we're headed. It proposes as the first test for a nation the quality of its people. This kind of society will not flower spontaneously from swelling riches, and surging power. It will not be the gift of government or the creation of presidents. It will require of every American for many generations both faith in the destination and the fortitude to make the journey. And like freedom itself, it will always be challenge and not fulfillment. And tonight, we accept that challenge. I propose that we begin a program in education to ensure every American child the fullest development of his mind and skills. I propose that we begin a massive attack on crippling and killing diseases. I propose that we launch a national effort to make the American city a better and a more stimulating place to live. I propose that we increase the beauty of America and end the poisoning of our rivers and the air that we breathe. I propose that we carry out a new program to develop regions of our country that are now suffering from distress and depression. I propose that we make new efforts to control and prevent crime and delinquency. I propose that we eliminate every remaining obstacle to the right and the opportunity to vote. I propose that we honor and support the achievements of thought and the creations of art. I propose that we make an all-out campaign against waste and inefficiency. Our basic task is threefold. First, to keep our economy growing. To open for all Americans the opportunity that is now enjoyed by most Americans, and to improve the quality of life for all. In the next 6 weeks, I will submit special messages with detailed proposals for national action in each of these areas.